stupid! You're so stupid! Hello, and welcome to Government is Fucking Stupid. Today I wanted to talk about a rare win for us peasants in the form of the courts recently ruling that the National Firearm Act 1934's inclusion of noise suppressors in the tax registry scheme that is the NFA 34 was in fact unconstitutional. Sadly, however, the government is famously bad at taking losses, and the BATF is doing what it can to force retailers and gun owners into compliance with the now unconstitutional law, and the independent judiciary does not ever really like to stray too far from the government that it is very much a part of, and the ruling was very, very narrow. So it seems to only apply to the noise suppressors manufactured by the specific plaintiffs in the case. What the hell am I even talking about? Well, let's back up. Way back in 1934, the standard issue rifle to the U.S. military was the 1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle. And this wouldn't be replaced for another couple of years by the M1 Garand, which is a semi-automatic rifle, meaning it fired once per pull of the trigger. Meanwhile, anyone with about $200 to spend could, which is about $5,000 in today's money, could go into just about any hardware store in 1933 and buy a fully automatic Thompson submachine gun in .45 ACP caliber. Now, there is no real comparison between the power of a rifle cartridge versus a handgun cartridge, but the massive ammo capacity of the Thompson and its huge rate of fire made it a formidable weapon, so much so that the United States government did issue them to troops in World War II. In the hands of Depression-era bank robbers and criminal gangs, arms like the Thompson or the Browning automatic rifle, which was essentially just a light machine gun, gave the baddies a huge firepower advantage over the local constables in their .38 special revolvers. But this was the 20th century, early 20th century USA, so the government was still pretending that the Constitution actually meant something, so they just couldn't go in and ban Thompson submachine guns from civilian ownership, or BARs, Browning automatic rifles, and similar such guns, because that would be a pretty obvious infringement on the peasant's Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. But as George Washington himself proved shortly after taking office, the government can and will just tax whatever the hell it wants, and will even send federal troops to collect that tax if you resist. So the government decided that if it just couldn't ban interesting guns from civilian hands, it would just tax them out of existence. So the National Firearms Act of 1934 was born, and it required all fully automatic arms to be registered with the government so that they could be issued a $200 tax stamp for each such gun owned. Now, adjusting for inflation, $200 is about a $5,000 tax on top of the price of the gun to be taxed. So this effectively stopped the civilian ownership and sale of fully automatic guns, which is just what the government intended to do. Anyway, fast forward a bit. After the CIA schwacked John F. Kennedy out of self-defense and then blamed some dumb patsy with an Italian bolt gun for the murder, the government decided that they would have to move against the means by which Oswald supposedly obtained that Carcano rifle, which was via mail order. So the Gun Control Act of 1968, among other things, forbade the transference of firearms by mail order. One other thing it did was it added noise suppressors to the list of things that had to be registered with the NFA and then were subject to that same $200 tax. And it also did the same thing with short-barreled rifles. And then since the prohibition on short-barreled rifles is another bit of government fucking stupidity, big enough for its own video, I won't really go into much detail on those here because the recent court ruling in Texas didn't cover SBRs, and I'll be getting to that court ruling here in a minute. But anyway, so gun control, the 1968 Gun Control Act goes through, and now all noise suppressors are subject to the same registration and tax stamp that machine guns are. Now, by 1968, the Federal Reserve banks had been enriching themselves massively by devaluating the dollar for years now, so that $200 tax in 1968 was just a paltry $2,000 in today's money. But, compared to the $5,000 it was worth just 34 years prior, But again, to the average peasant in 1968, an extra $2,000 was a huge amount of money to pay just to shave 20 to 30 decibels off the sound of their gun going off. And that decibel savings was going to be temporary because back then noise suppressor technology was nothing like it is today, and those suppressors tended to wear out and stop working effectively over time. So noise suppressors ended up then, in the wake of 1968, becoming just as rare among civilians as machine guns were, which again is just what the government intended. It couldn't ban them outright, it just made them so expensive to own that the poors weren't going to be buying them. So let's fast forward several more decades now, and of continued Federal Reserve scheming and the resulting devaluation of the dollar, and now in today's money, that $200 NFA tax just isn't as onerous as it once was, and the government, blessedly, has never adjusted it for inflation over all these decades. So owning an interesting gun or a suppressed gun isn't basically prohibitively expensive anymore. It's just another hurdle that gun owners would have to clamber over in order to do it. And clamber over it we did. In 2010, there were about 285,000 noise suppressors registered with the National Firearms Act. By 2024, that would surge to 3.5 million noise suppressors, and with the elimination of the $200 tax on those suppressors that went into effect on January 1st of 2026, by mid-2026, that number had ballooned to 6.3 million suppressors on the NFA registry. And it was the elimination of that $200 tax that brings us to where we are today. U.S. District Judge James Wesley Hendricks ruled on August 5th that because the tax on noise suppressors wasn't raising any revenue, it wasn't really a tax, it was just a regulatory law that was unconstitutional. This is actually the same fate that befell the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act of 1937, which was actually modeled after the NFA of 34. In that the tax stamp of the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act didn't ban marijuana, it just made it subject to a tax stamp that the government just knew they were never going to make available. In 1969, a judge noticed this, that, well, the marijuana tax stamp law wasn't raising any revenue, so it wasn't actually a tax law, it was just an unconstitutional regulatory law, and so the courts struck down the Tax Stamp Act of 37. Now, the government responded the next year by simply passing a law that banned marijuana outright because the government only cares about crushing the rights of the citizenry and doesn't really give a fuck what the Constitution says. Which is why it's kind of odd that the government didn't seek an emergency injunction against the Texas ruling, but then that might have been due to the fact that the scope of the ruling was very limited and the details are still up for debate. But at the end of the day, it bears pointing out that the entire thing is just really fucking stupid. Starting with the existence of NFA 34 and especially GCA 68's inclusion of noise suppressors into the tax registry to begin with. Okay, the reason noise suppressors even found their way into the ban, tax registry, was an ignorance-fueled fear driven by government that likes to see its peasants unarmed. I mean, you got to remember, this is the same government that saw its way clear to banning switchblade knives over West Side Story and fears of, the play and the film adaptation just causing a surge in youth violence and stabbings. Obviously, this never happened, but the switchblade ban still stood for many, many years anyway. And likewise, films like The Manchurian Candidate, which featured the use of a suppressed gun to commit murders, led to this ban, tax registry of noise suppressors. I mean, never mind the fact that in the film The Manchurian Candidate, the suppressed firearm is a revolver, and suppressing a revolver is extremely difficult since gases tend to escape out between the gap between the cylinder and forcing cone anyway, and those make noise, and the suppressor isn't there to catch that gas, so again, you can't really reliably suppress a revolver, but that doesn't matter. Nor does it matter that the sound effect for suppressed firearms that the movies tended to use came from a bullet ricochet sound effect from an older movie that was then trimmed down to that little mouse fart sound that became famous in movies as the sound a suppressor makes, even though it bears no resemblance to how suppressors actually work in the real world. Because see, inside this atmospheric dome on this particular wet rock that's orbiting its unremarkable yellow dwarf star we call Earth, A suppressor is only capable of reducing the noise of a gunshot by about 20 to 35 decibels. So if you've got an AR-15 running regular ammo, it's going to make about 165 decibels at the muzzle every time you pull the trigger. Putting a can, what the cool kids call a suppressor, on that gun will take the noise rating down to about 130 or so decibels. Now, for comparison, 130 decibels is about the volume of sound an F-16 Fighting Falcon makes when it lights the afterburners on takeoff if you're standing relatively close. Or if you're running a pneumatic jackhammer smashing through concrete, you're subjecting yourself to about 130 decibels of sound, which is punishing loud. Now, a non-suppressed 9mm handgun makes about 155 to 167 decibels, which is still above the 140 decibel pain threshold that most people, that's kind of the line for most people. 140 decibels is known as the pain threshold. Now, suppressing a 9mm with if you're using subsonic ammo and a suppressor, you can get that noise down to about 125 to 132 decibels. But if you're using regular supersonic ammo, that's going to go back up to about 133 to 140 or more decibels due to the sonic boom the bullet makes leaving the barrel. Point being, suppressed firearms do not sound like a mouse fart. They are still very, very loud. They're just not quite as deafeningly loud to the user as a non-suppressed firearm is. In fact, many European countries where firearm ownership is heavily regulated and restricted, noise suppressors generally are not so regulated and restricted. The thought being that if you can reduce the noise coming from a firearm, it's going to make everybody else's ability to enjoy the countryside that much easier because somebody off hunting in the distance isn't making quite such a racket. Weird. I mean, it's almost like these European governments use like facts and logic to arrive at that conclusion rather than ignorance and hysteria. Very ungovernment-like, but that's just how it is there. Kind of weird. Anyway, the coming weeks will tell if the government is just going to move against the decision and re-regulate noise suppressors the way they did marijuana once the original marijuana regulatory scheme was struck down by the courts. Or if the government will just lay down and take the loss, which isn't very government-like. So it's going to be, I'll be real curious to see what happens with this. If noise suppressors from the brands that were the plaintiffs in the case remain unregulated, or I would be really surprised to see if the ruling is expanded to include all noise suppressors. That would be amazing. And another question that's going to need answered is that of short-barreled rifles, which I mentioned earlier. Those were added to the Gun Control Act of 1968 as well, and the tax on those was reduced to $0 as of January 1st this year also. So the tax stamp on short-barreled rifles isn't raising any money, and so should be just as unconstitutional as the non-revenue raising tax stamp on noise suppressors was. But we'll just have to see what happens there. And of course, all of this bullshit could have just been completely avoided if we the people were smart enough to reject allowing ourselves to be governed by other people to begin with. Because, let's face it, government, no matter what, is always fucking stupid. Anyway, thanks for sticking it out this long, and I'll see you on the next one. And in the meantime, please don't be stupid.